everyone. My name is Amanda Beam. I am Associate Director of the Berkeley Economy and Society Initiative. And on behalf of BESI, let me welcome you to this expert panel discussion on governance in California and the search for better paths forward. After a busy semester, it's great to see so many new as well as returning faces. A little bit about BESI. BESI is an evolving enterprise founded now almost 3 years ago, and I will say with a fairly bold mission, tackling generation-defining shifts at the interface of political and economic power. So BESI researchers have been working to illuminate, among other things, the political economy of the green transition, cascading social imbalances brought about by disruptive technologies, and the outsized role played by powerful economic interests in politics. Running through all our projects is a robust defense of democratic practice rooted in shared prosperity, accountability, and the capacity for collective change. This convening on governing California couldn't be more timely. For the past year, BESI has been building out a research program for understanding and addressing the deepening dysfunction of political economic systems in the Golden State. Spearheaded by Sam Trackman and our director, Paul Pearson, BESI's California Political Economy Program is tackling the gap between California's immense wealth and economic power on one side, and problems such as severe unaffordability, outmigration, and public distrust in government on the other. I should mention here that Paul is out sick today. I think I'm the least sick of all of us, but I'm sure many of you have also rallied. But he's with us in spirit, and he knows that we're going to get to the bottom of all this in the next hour and a half. Governance and accountability are at the core of any holistic, durable response to these challenges. That is why we are excited to have Sam and 3 expert scholars and practitioners with us today to discuss the underlying drivers of and potential solutions to governance problems and policy implementation failures in California. So I get to introduce our moderator. Sam Trackman is a senior researcher at BESI, where he leads the program on the political economy of California. Sam has a PhD in political science from UC Berkeley and has published widely in academic journals. I've been forbidden from listing all of them, but it is impressive. And from there, over to you, Sam.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda, and thank you guys all for being here. Extra thanks to our distinguished panelists, who I'll introduce shortly. So the purpose of this panel is to critically examine the quality of governance and policy implementation in California. Our hope is to draw on the insights of our 3 panelists to develop a better understanding of the drivers of California's governance struggles and what could be done moving forward to improve. This is an important topic for many reasons, including that California is home to nearly 40 million people, and it's an essential growth engine for the US economy. California governance has received much criticism over the past several years from both sides of the political spectrum. We're unaware of rigorous analysis that compares the quality of governance across different states, and this would be a really fraught social scientific task, but we can say with confidence that California governance could certainly improve. Among other issues in recent years, we've seen delays and massive cost overruns in the high-speed rail project. We've seen a failure to build enough homes and rampant homelessness. We've seen California consistently with the nation's highest poverty rate once you adjust for cost of living. And we've seen dysfunctional provision of unemployment insurance during California's COVID-19 pandemic. So we have a distinguished panel here today to help us better understand the drivers of governance problems in California and potential ways to improve. First, we have Melissa Breach, who's the founder and CEO of the advocacy organization Prosperity California. She previously was the chief operating officer for California YIMBY and was also the executive director of the League of Women Voters of California. Next, we have Thad Kauser, who's a professor of political science at UC San Diego. Thad has written numerous articles and books and is one of the foremost academic experts on California politics. He received his PhD in political science from UC Berkeley. And we have Ted Lempert, who is the president of the advocacy organization Children Now. He previously served 4 terms in the California State Assembly from 1988 to 2000 and Ted currently teaches a California politics course to undergrads at Berkeley. We had a fourth panelist who had to cancel last minute, Nancy Skinner, who previously served in the California State Senate and was pulled away due to her work at the California Energy Commission. Though she can't be here, Nancy has generously provided some written comments to our questions, which I have here, and we can hopefully refer to throughout. So I'm going to moderate a discussion with the panelists for the next hour or so, and then we'll do 20 to 30 minutes of audience Q&A. So please think about questions you have as we're talking. For the panelists, you are invited to answer any questions, but you also do not have to respond to every question. So to start us off, in your view, to what extent does California have a governance problem? If you were to give California state government a grade for its performance over the past decade, what would it be and why? Is California governance getting better or worse over time in your estimation? And we'll start with Melissa.
Well, I have no idea if it's getting better or worse over time because I think we haven't really researched that. We haven't parsed it by specific dates. What I can say is that the challenges are becoming more pressing. The circumstances in which governance challenges are coming up are becoming a larger issue. I think it's also important to say, like, maybe before I continue, that I am not like a dignitary or a dignified person. I'm not an academic, right? I've spent the last 30 years of my career trying to work with academics to figure out good policy and then lean on stuff until it tips over. So I'll try and give you kind of the straight skinny from that point of view, but just want to point out there's people at this table who know more than I do about so many things, and people in the audience who are incredibly informed. And I'll point specifically to Kate and to Chris as two people that I really rely on. But yes, we have a very problematic governance structure in that we are unable to do the things, we are unable to meet the goals that California has stated, right? We do not have the governance structure that allows us to build the housing we have set for a goal, to reduce the impacts of climate change, to close the growing wealth gap, and those are governance challenges. I would give us a D-, but I am a really hard grader. So I'm grading that California to California, not California against every other state, which I think is a really important distinction. And the last thing I'll just say as we think about governance is we're going to talk about it as a policy exercise because that's the nature of this conversation. But so much of what we're going to talk about today is really about a culture of how the government works, about how our governance works. And that's an important distinction because you can put in place the right policy, but if people don't want it, if they don't want to make those changes, they're not going to. It is much easier to skirt adoption of good policy than it is to write policy you cannot skirt. That's all.
Thanks. That.
All right. So is California a failed government? Well, as any good listener of Fox News knows, California is a failure and politics is the problem. We've heard that. We've heard that increasingly in the national narrative. And to be fair, it is not just on the right. Right? Remember back to the global economic crisis when California was facing persistent budget deficits. People were calling for a California Constitutional Convention. They were saying, you heard the term over and over again, California was ungovernable. And Kevin Starr, who's essentially our unofficial state historian, questioned whether we were a failed state. So today, you've seen more and more of these attacks coming, in the language of current politics, calling California dumpster fire, right? Pointing to crime, failed schools, homelessness, and California's reaction to COVID. So really, there's on both sides a critique of California, and that critique really focuses on governance, right? And especially the time when California moved into becoming a strongly left-leaning state, right? It was not always that way. It was a purple state, a bellwether in presidential elections. When I first worked in the state legislature, when Ted was serving, it was a purple state split between the two parties. 2000 and onwards, and especially 2010 and onwards, it's become dominated by Democrats. So what has that wrought? To answer this question, I wanted to do a little bit of research looking across states, right? And so one of the essential questions of a state government is, does the government deliver the policies that the people want? does government match up? Do the policy choices of each state government match up with what the average voter wants? And so the most comprehensive and authoritative study on this comes from Jeff Lax and Justin Phillips, two political scientists at Columbia, published in the American Journal of Political Science. And it looked at 53 different policy areas and matched up what voters wanted, what states delivered. And California was number one, right? Now there are probably, and no, none of these professors related to the university, employed by the University of California. So that's the most rigorous and comprehensive study I've seen. But there's a problem with sort of what do the voters want, because that's just what the average voter wants. And sometimes you miss what someone in the minority party wants. And one of the things that we'll talk about today is sort of where Republicans lie, and even some independents in the current California politics. But another way to look at government is not whether it delivers what voters want, but whether it delivers what one set of voters wants, but whether it delivers the things that all people and residents of the state really need and desire, right? What is the effect of California on governance in the 21st century on the welfare of Californians in key areas that states have responsibility: education, crime, healthcare, housing, homelessness, and the growth of the economy. And so I looked at all of these, and what you find is this. So if you look at crime rates, California used to be a relatively high crime state with like the third highest homicide rate in 1980. California crime is now 1/3 of what it was in 1980 and 2/3 of what it was in 2006. It has gone down and down and down precipitously. And it's gone down faster. If you look at homicide rates, it's gone down much faster than any other state. We used to be much higher in murders. Now we're far below the national average. And really a lot of this, if you're looking for policies, California in the late 90s started aggressively moving towards gun control laws, something that it had not done at all in its purple period of governance. And it was able to do this without increasing, and in fact, while it decreased the prison population dramatically. So the prison population, state prison population, moved from about 160,000 to below 100,000, and as a recent report by the Public Policy Institute shows, most of the people in prison are there for violent crimes rather than property and drug crimes. That's only a very small percent. So it's able to do both of those things. In education, we used to be about 10 points below the rest of the nation, significantly below on the major tests of like 8th grade reading, 8th grade math that are comparable across all states in the year 2000. California invested in class size reduction at different levels in the late 90s and the early 2000s, and then attacked one of the biggest things, which was an imbalance in funding with a new local control funding formula that sent more funding to schools that had more students who are English language learners or foster children or came from low-income homes. That has dramatically caused a rebalancing of funding and an increase that is now caught up on these measures with the national average. We still have a long way to go, but we're now no longer lagging behind the nation on education. And if you look at higher education, we're clearly, this is UC Berkeley, we're the nation's leaders in both sort of prestige and research, but also importantly in Raj Chetty at Harvard, his measures of economic intergenerational mobility. Berkeley and UC San Diego stand out, and all of the UCs do very highly on that. If you look at housing, that's an area where clearly we lag. That's why California YIMBY and everything else is so important. We moved from about 50,000 new home starts a year to about 110,000 over the last 6 or 7 years. So we're improving, but we still lag behind Florida and Texas. And that's clearly an area of focus. Homelessness is an area where everyone knows California has more homeless in raw numbers than anywhere else. Research done by UC Berkeley's center shows that all this spending we're doing is very good at getting individuals into homes, but we can't keep pace of the new homeless population that's being generated by our high housing costs. So that's a huge area to go. And then finally, if you look at just the environment, if you look at our COVID response, we were massively better than any other large state in reducing, in having fewer mortalities. So about half of the deaths that Florida had. And finally, if you look at the economy, this is often something where we see a trade-off between the environmental protections that California has pursued and the economic growth policies that a state like Texas has pursued. And these states have often been put in juxtaposition in the national conversation. And so you might think, well, since 2000, like how much economic growth has California given up in order to have its stronger environmental standards, stronger environmental enforcement? The answer, if you look at the growth in per capita income, is California and Texas were about even. We were both in the low 30s in per capita income, but low 30,000s in the year 2000. California has far surpassed Texas. Now, Texas average to per capita income is 68,000 and California is 86,000, with a lot of that growth coming even through COVID. So California has grown faster in its economy. Now, whether that growth is even is something we'll get into in debate. But California, on all of these objective measures, has been performing very well. So there are clearly problems with its governance, but I think we should start by thinking not about changing everything in California, not about rewriting its constitution, but about fixing the problems and recognizing the underlying strength of California governance.
Thanks, Ted.
So I should be sitting in between these two because I go to C. So I'm going to right in the middle. Before I explain why, just a couple clarifications. If I cough, I'm not sick. I've been losing my voice since Thanksgiving. I don't know if it was a family argument, but so that maybe it was. And then the other thing was mentioned that Nancy Skinner wasn't able to make it. A lot of legislators get along, but especially once you're turned out, you really get along. So Nancy and I are friends, and so I have all her answers. So I'll wear two hats. Weave in some of her answers with mine. And then speaking of two hats, this was mentioned, I will speak to you as a children's advocate and as I am teaching California politics here as well as a former legislator. So the reason C, it's pretty funny, we're doing our children's report card that Children Out publishes every other year. Make sure you read it in January. And the average grade sneak peek, it's not out till January, we're moving from a C- 2 years ago to a C. So kids aren't everything, but if you think of government, national government, kids is very minor, tiny part of the budget. City government, part, little piece of the government. State government really is the kids' level of government, right? More if you look at early childhood, K to 12, higher education, kids' health, we're talking more than half the budget, right? So how kids are faring is pretty key. And so the fact that we're giving the grades are a C overall for how state policymakers are dealing with kids, I think I'll apply to the governance because there is some connection there. And, sort of pick out with that thing on some areas, and we say this a lot as kids advocates, on some areas, California rocks. We're leading the country. And so clearly, despite the governance challenges, we do real well. But on other areas, housing was mentioned, and, if the president allows me to say it, affordability, we don't do well. And just on the kids piece, I think some things that will surprise you, some of our lower grades that we'll get into because it has to deal with interest groups, the size of legislative districts. There's a mental health emergency going on among our young people, not crisis, emergency. Do you know it's harder here to access mental health services as a youth than any other state? Why is that? Well, power of interest groups, right? The health plans have more power here than any other state. Yes, we've made some improvement in education and appreciate the call it to local control funding for something we worked very hard on. But our education system in a lot of respects certainly doesn't befit where California used to be, but is behind on some really key areas. And one, for example, we give a D grade is adults on campus. We rank in the bottom 5 states of nurses, counselors, teachers, assistant principals. And we talk about affordability in the state. If you go to a really expensive private school, the first thing you'll see is a lot of adults with a lot of kids who arguably need it the least. You go to most public schools in this state, you see very few adults. So there's some very low grades in our kids' report card. And since we had to apply those grades, I'm in the mood to just give a grade on governance. So just, I guess the other piece of say, I'm really look forward to digging into this. I think the Schwarzenegger reforms, I think, have helped to some degree. The top 2, the redistrict, we can talk about redistricting, but the Independent Redistricting Commission changing the term limits, making it a little better, has certainly helped. It's interesting that the vote on the budget, making now majority, I think in some ways has exacerbated some problems. But just the last piece I'll say on governance is that because our districts are so large in this state, I ask my undergraduate students, don't look at your phones, don't look at anything. Who are your state assembly member and state senators? And most have no idea. And these are political science students at UC Berkeley. And that is not how most states are. I mean, a friend of mine served in the New Hampshire legislature. The district's like a few thousand people. Yeah, you know everyone. And so guess what? Issues like education and housing and childcare and things that make a difference, get responded to better, because it doesn't matter what the teachers union says. It doesn't matter what the Chamber of Commerce says, because you know your legislator. In California, no one knows their legislator. So I've had private conversations with most of the current legislators on education issues, for example. It's not how they vote. And that's a governance problem. And that's partly just because of the size of our district, the power of interest groups, money, and some of the other issues we'll get into.
Thanks. So most political scientists believe that party competition is essential for government accountability. In California today, we now really only have one relevant party, the Democrats, though Republicans do participate, and you need their votes on certain issues. But what, in your view, are the governance implications of the Republican Party's inability to compete in California? And assuming that more party competition would be a good thing, are there structural reforms to consider that might increase it? And we'll start with that this time.
Okay. So I've, along with a colleague named Gerald Gamm at the University of Rochester, I've been an unrepentant fan of party competition and booster of it, because what party competition does is it means there's someone else waiting in the wings if you do not perform, right? If you do not, if your party doesn't advance a positive program for the state, there's a realistic option. That is gone right now in California, right? Democrats are not fighting for their political lives. And all that fear of losing out and losing control is often what binds parties together to back something that, to come up with a cohesive platform, to whip each other into shape, and to say, if we don't stand for something, we're going to potentially lose power 2 years from now. And so I think that the research that we've done, which is kind of looking across all states from 1880 until the present period, over and over again, we were finding that two-party competition was what led states to move from kind of these venues for log rolling, where everyone just did their own district bills, to states that created long-term statewide policies. It shifted away from district spending to more statewide spending, and then the latest paper we did showed that it led to more investments in healthcare, education, that then later paid off in things like more people graduating from high school, getting rid of infant mortality sooner, and people living longer lives. But all of that was historical work that was done in a period from 1880 to 1980, because that was when our data set had stopped. And when we gave this in talks, people said, well, that sounds right for one era of modern politics, where basically you get more and more things as you get closer and closer to 50-50, and fewer things of what we want from government as you get away from that. But things have changed, right? The parties have changed in what they stand for. The parties have taken these different steps. And we think now, in fact, it's increasing Democratic Party control that should lead to more investments in healthcare, more investments in income, and better long-term policy payoffs. And so we sort of took that challenge, gathered the data through 2020, and much to our booster hearts of party competition, much to the surprise of people who really liked party competition, in the modern era, it's not party competition that delivers more of that, it's more Democratic control. And so I would say I have reluctantly come to the side of to this view on California. It is a problem, especially for Republicans, that Republicans are no longer a viable political force in California. It leads to Republicans feeling alienated, feeling that they have no representation, no stake in Sacramento, wanting to secede from the state. And I think it's why, especially after Prop 50, we're going to see more and more proposals to divide up the state. But if you look at overall the sorts of outcomes that I was talking about earlier, they're probably benefited by increasing Democratic control and by a Democratic Party that doesn't have to sort of bargain with the Republican minority over the budget like they used to before the 2/3 rule. And so in that, I'm torn about whether we should recommend proposals that would lead to more competition. If you want more competition, pass proportional representation. That would give Republicans 40% of the seats in the state legislature. Very likely in the short term, but potentially lead to a flowering of more parties, some of which we might love, some of which we might really hate. Look at Europe right now with immigration parties. But that would be the solution. But I'm not sure right now that solution would solve our problems.
Well, part of this is how do you define Republican? If it's MAGA, no. If it's Mitt Romney and the Republicans I served with years ago, I think it really helps. It's funny, Nancy Skinner wrote a couple things I was going to say too, and that is, we used to have this 2/3 vote requirement for the budget, and basically this was before Democrats had the supermajority, and basically that meant it really was both parties having to agree, and I think there was a lot of positive to that. And it's like, do you believe in the filibuster or not? Would you rather have the Senate, U.S. Senate be 51 votes or not? So we sort of had that requirement in California. That's gone, and now it's even crazy because Democrats have a supermajority, they don't even need all their members to vote for the budget. The Republicans are totally shut out. I've had Republican members come to me and say, "Oh, we're going to vote against the budget because it doesn't do enough for childcare and doesn't do enough for education, doesn't do enough for kids." They can say anything they want. They're never going to vote for it, and so it really, I think, causes a problem there. And the other issue that Nancy brought up, which I really appreciated, given the power of public sector unions in California, she cited some examples of where they needed Republican votes to make some police reforms, because some of the Republicans voted for it because they were close to the police chiefs and weren't as pushed by the unions as a lot of the Democrats were. So I thought that was an interesting anecdote where the public sector unions dominate California. California ranks number one in public sector support, public sector union support, and there's some pros to that. I would personally like that's more be in the private sector than the public sector. But, unions so dominate the agenda in California over the last couple of decades, where if you had more of a bipartisanship Republican voice, that wouldn't be as much. And the police unions, a great example, very few reforms passed even after the murder of George Floyd, which just, gives you a sense of their power in this state.
Thanks. You want to jump in?
I actually do on this. I happen to do a ton of work on housing. And it's one of the areas where we depend deeply on Republican votes to pass bills. And I think that's true for other areas as well. I think for me, prior to this, when I was at the League of Women Voters, I was deeply involved in the Citizens Redistricting Commission. Not because I think fundamentally that we need to have more Republicans elected to the legislature, but because I fundamentally believe that if you elect a Republican as a citizen, you are entitled to that representation. They need to have the ability to govern. Otherwise, you're not disenfranchising the elected official, you're disenfranchising the voter. And that's hard when you sit in this period of time. When you look at something like Prop 50, you look at that 3 years ago, and it's really easy to say, we should not be doing that. That's gerrymandering. You look at it today, and you're looking at it within the context of a constitutional crisis. I mean, a constitutional crisis within the country and a rising tide of authoritarianism globally as well as in the country. And so I think the conversation about what do we need to do to get balance is like a moving target right now is kind of what I want to say about it. I think for me, it's about making sure, though, that when people are elected, if somebody's coming forth with a good policy, with a good idea, partisan politics should not say, you can't move that bill because you're a Republican. That is a problem. That weakens everybody across the board. It drives division. And there are, in California, Republicans still that they want to be relevant. They want to do work. They're willing to compromise. And we're running the risk of damaging that, I think, long term. And then the only other thing that I'll say is, it is a cultural problem, right? It's a financial problem. If you had publicly financed elections, who ran for office, who wins office would look really, really different. What I can't say is if that happened, we'd get better governance, because that is 100% unknown. Right, we don't know that, but we do know it would be more democratic.
So building on some comments that we just had, one of the core governance challenges in California seems to be the power of organized interests, particularly certain businesses and unions, to block policy reforms that would have broad benefits. Why, in your view, are these groups so powerful? what might be done to make it easier to achieve reforms that would benefit the state as a whole, even if they threaten the material interests of powerful groups. And we'll start with Ted this time.
Yeah, I think I'd touch on that. I mean, I'll just go back to the size of the districts. It's why interest groups can be so powerful in Congress and, in California legislature, because you don't know who the person is, so you rely on the interest group, and, the governor or president are a little more immune from that. So, I think if our districts were smaller, interest groups would have a little less influence. I'm not quite sure what we do about that, although I was just thinking, right now it's about $1 million for state senate, $500,000 for state assembly. So if we doubled, tripled, quadrupled the size of the legislature, I'm not sure how you would manage that, but it would help I'm not suggesting that, but it would help the interest group problem. Because it takes so much money to run for the legislature, and folks are so reliant on what the interest group says with independent expenditures now. You have legislators literally scared to death that they cast a vote. An interest group can just swoop in. And my own personal experience, I personally knocked on the doors of a quarter of my district. Okay, that if the districts were 4 times smaller, I could have knocked on the whole district and been more immune from interest group pressure. So I think that's one one piece. And then obviously campaign finance reform. I urge folks to not talk about Citizens United, which California had the Citizens United problem before Citizens United, but Buckley v. Vallejo, and that. If there was a way to overturn that case, and maybe someday it will, so money on campaigns isn't free speech, obviously that would help a lot. But until then, I'm not sure public finance, well, it sounds good. Play that out. Are we really going to publicly fund every election in California, given the number of voters we have? So why if Nancy says do public finance, I'm a little less sure that's the answer, just because of the amount of money we'd be talking about that wouldn't go to other basic services.
Melissa?
I mean, I think if you do public finance and you don't and people have to choose between whether or not they're getting funding from a public entity, or they're able to raise it in large swaths, I think that's the best thing to evaluate, to try and assess that. Because you will get people who are like, yeah, I'll come in, I'll take the public financing, and I'll agree that I won't take gifts over $500 or $250 or $50. I think we don't know exactly how that would work, but we can look at how it's working in some local places and extrapolate. But I think the larger concern is, we can talk about the special interests of business and unions, but I don't want them to have outsized interest, but you can't only pull one side of that, right? You can't only get rid of the union problem and leave the big business problem. Totally. And that is fundamentally, when we talk about fixing this, make no mistake, that's the direction it's going to go in, because it's much easier to control for one side than the other. And so I think the question we should ask is, why does it take so much to run for office? And then how are we basically going to deal with, sorry, I'm having a little momentary loss of my thought, but how are we going to deal with the fact that it's not just they have a interest. It's how far-reaching that interest can grow. And so an example of this would be on housing or on infrastructure or on land use. You look at unions. Well, unions fundamentally don't get in each other's business. That's the union deal. So you could be a member of a union that feels really strongly that we need to build a ton of housing, but you're not historically going to have stepped up to the building trades who are intervening in that, because that's their bailiwick, that's their thing. You wouldn't want them coming after you to tell you what you should be doing around nursing, right, if you're the nurses union. But the problem has gotten so bad that you see the carpenters, you see SEIU, you see other unions starting to kind of get into that housing space and kind of push back. And the reason isn't because anything has shifted, other than if you run a union for working class employees, low wage workers, your phone rings every day in California with a member of your union telling you they are homeless or about to become homeless every day. And so for me, it's not just about how do we limit their influence. It's how do we hold them accountable for their stated responsibilities to their membership is a piece of it for me.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, I hope we have the chance to dive a little bit more into the politics of housing, because I'd love to hear, since you were in the middle of these fights, in some ways, whether interest group power, which I think we all recognize as a challenge, right? That's what blocks reform. Why are interest groups powerful? Because they have money. Why are they able to exercise that money in politics? Because a series of Supreme Court decisions that this current court in no way going to retreat on Citizens United and Buckley v. Vallejo, we are not going to move away from the regime of campaign finance. And when you do things like have public finance, and we've seen this in some of the other states, one of the problems is even if I can pledge to not take a gift or money in exchange for public finance, that doesn't mean that someone's not going to run an independent expenditure on my behalf. And that's what we've seen over and over again in states like Maine and Arizona, where we've seen this public finance. Bruce Kayne's hydrological theory of money in politics, it's going to find a way and flow into politics somewhere. So this is the world that we're in. Is that the facet of this world that has stopped progress on things like housing? If you look at Senate Bill 50 and Senate Bill 79, one of the major bills on housing that finally pushed over the hill to succeed, there were labor unions on both sides. There were environmental groups on both sides. There were some business groups on both sides. And it seemed like at the end of the day, my sense was that it wasn't passed because there wasn't the political will among moderate Democrats to pass it until there finally was, and there were fewer moderate Democrats. So as we dive into some of these problems, like I think that is something that was both a failure and now potentially a success of California government, where it really wasn't the interest groups that was the problem. It was like what individual people wanted, and the dream of a single family home at odds with the dream of others who wanted to actually have somewhere to live. But maybe we'll have more chance to.
Want to respond to that, Melissa?
I do, because can you repeat the last thing that you said to make sure I disagree with it?
Yeah, I'll state it in a way, most likely. The interest group power wasn't the thing that stopped this, that it was actually that you had these two groups of people who wanted really different things in the population.
Yeah, so I think that is kind of true, but it ignores something that's really important here, which is that it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if at the end of the day you had these balanced supporters. When you look at the history of a policy and the history of the bill, and you see how it evolves over time, those stakeholders are in how those bills are being changed.
Yeah.
How they are being amended, how they are being made smaller, how they are being made harder to implement, how people are going, well, in order to pass this bill, now that I see that there's this complex thing on two sides, I, as a state legislature, want my county exempted.
San Diego.
Right? That is a governance problem, and it is a big governance problem. And I would say when you look at something like the unions, you have to look at CEQA. So the unions oppose CEQA reform. They don't oppose CEQA reform because they have a stake in really important environmental protection. And I say that being someone who has a stake in really important environmental protection. But what they're doing is they're basically protecting their right to extract concessions. And that's the problem.
So I think that's a good segue into a question about the governor, because the governor ultimately wielded his power over the budget to make CEQA reform happen this year. So some political science research suggests that governors are the ones best placed to champion reforms that generate broad benefits for the state. To what extent does California governance depend on the governor, and what traits should the public be looking for when they're picking one? We'll start here again.
Yeah, I mean, the governor's the game. Yep. In California, the governor signs laws or they don't happen. That's the game. I think, one of the things that's really interesting to me is you don't want to say we're only going to have governors at the end of their career, right? You want to have young, dynamic legislative leaders. But man, there's something nice about governing a state like California when you're not going to your next job.
Yep.
Because there are things, no one could have made the decisions that Governor Brown made in his second term, in his second round, if they had to go and run for office after that. And so one thing I think is electing people who have a really clear demonstrated history of what they believe in that they're going to defend, right? As opposed to who has the money to run for office. I think a history is really, really important. I think who they're going to put in charge of who they're going to put in charge of departments and how they're going to respond to those department heads. So when they put someone in charge of a department and that head says, we don't want that bill, is their default going to be, well, that's my guy because I put him in this department? That makes big things really, really hard. And then in terms of what I would want to see in a governor and what I hope people are looking for is demonstrated competence, an ability to work effectively with people with whom you disagree, and the ability to, I'm a transparency person, but I think it's worth noting that there are things we do very, very deliberately in California that if you think of good governance as being efficient, are not efficient, but still important. And I look at something like the Brown Act. The Brown Act does not make it easier to solve big problems because big problems get solved in dark rooms. That's the truth. But bad things also happen in dark rooms, right? So it's a material problem.
You want to tell people what the Brown Act is?
Oh, it's public transparency
Sunshine.
about public meetings. And do you want to give it?
It's sunshine. You can't have, if we were city council, two of us couldn't get in the hallway and talk about something on our agenda, essentially. Or three.
Two of you could.
Three. Yeah, sorry. Thank you. Thank you.
You have to deliberate publicly in the full light of day is what it basically means. Yeah.
Thad, you're up.
Yeah, so thinking about, this question got me thinking about the current governor's race we have, obviously, and the crop of candidates who, at least the initial crop of candidates, are as experienced and qualified a set of lawmakers as I've seen in a long time. You had people like Tony Atkins, first legislator in more than a century to be both the Speaker of the Assembly and the President pro tem of the state Senate. You have the sitting superintendent of schools, who was a legislator before that. You have a treasurer, I believe, who's before that. You had a lieutenant governor. A real set of Sacramento, deeply experienced power players who knew the ins and outs of California politics, and none of them polled more than like 4%. Californians not interested whatsoever, and we keep looking and looking for someone who's a social media superstar from Congress to run for office, and that's what we may get. And why is that the case? In some ways, I think it actually is the fact that Sacramento experts were not resonating with the public is important because governors, the root of a governor's power, it's like the president's, the power to persuade. It's not anything formal. It's this informal ability to capture the public interest, to capture Sacramento's interest, to mobilize the broader California public, to be able to be bigger than the interest groups of California, and thus able to take them on, and in particular to have the popularity, the personal popularity that translates into legislative success. That was the biggest message of the book that I co-authored called The Power of American Governors, where we looked across the states at what governors were able to achieve and what they weren't able to achieve. And one of the fundamental things was it really didn't depend on governors' experience or governors' formal powers. What mattered were their soft powers, their informal powers, their popularity, how much tenure they had left, whether they were able to run for office. A lot of those things predicted being more powerful governors. So I think in some ways, California's addiction to someone who is a political superstar and sort of looking for that in their next governor is probably a realistic assessment of the fact that this is a huge state and we need a megastar to govern this mega state.
The governor's extraordinarily powerful. There was a political science study that showed that the only reason the California governor wasn't super powerful because we have a pluralistic executive branch with other elected offices, although Gavin's figured out a way around that. He just appoints them all. So they're all, but so that weakens the governor a little bit, but otherwise just super powerful. And let's just talk about education for a sec. And that might be obviously Prop 13, but close to Prop 13, why aren't California schools better? We're a high tax state, right? Come on, this is a state that the economy is built on education. Well, one answer, in addition to Prop 13, is in my lifetime, a governor of California has only prioritized education for 1 year. In my lifetime. Governor Gray Davis, first year in office. Education is my first, second, and third priority. Guess what happened? A ton. We had standards, we had beginning teacher programs, we had all these supports. Some of them still exist today. It was extraordinary how much was done. And it was a compromise. The unions like some, not others. But it's like governor said first, second, and third priority. And voila, we got a lot done. Imagine if Davis had stuck with that, other governors actually made education or kids a priority. Local control funding formula, that was one area where Governor Brown said, oh, I care about education, and boom. So, when we look at it as kids advocates, we're like, come on, Governor. And we've seen in other states, including red states, where they've made more progress in early childhood or education. I mean, not because of the current Texas governor, but because of past Texas governors. Texas does better than us with bilingual education. Texas does better than us on a lot of education stuff, not because of the current governor of Texas, but past gubernatorial leadership. So the governor is hugely powerful. In terms of this race, I have to be careful because I'm friends with, I know many of them well. Children Out can't take a position, but we've done webinars with all the leading cabinet members so far, and this is not an endorsement. I will just say if Betty Yee had the money, what she said in our webinar was, I'm not running for president, and she should probably put that out there as her slogan, because if they would all pledge that, I would agree they'd probably do a better job.
Just a quick trade-off. Is there a tension or a trade-off between a focus on governing California in an effective way and kind of leading the quote-unquote resistance from Sacramento?
You want to take that?
Yeah, yes. So first, to just lend some data to your totally correct insight. Governors who are, one of the things in our political model, and comes out of a formal model, but it shows up in all the quantitative stuff, is governors running for president do really badly because they're pitching things for their state that are wrong for their state, and they're pitching to the New Hampshire and South Carolina primary. But on this broader question of, if you look at how a governor staffs their administration, this governor's kind of moved between staffing it for DC, for future presidential ambitions, staffing it for California. When things went badly and recall, he staffed it for California. So it's who you're bringing in and what expertise they have, and that's where their eyes are at. That can affect a governor's ability to get things done. And secondly, every governor needs things from the president. And it is better to not be at war with the federal government that is going to decide on your waivers on environmental policy, your waivers on Medicaid, what kind of support to give after the wildfires in Los Angeles. And so it's a cost. That's not to say sometimes it's not extraordinary times call for a governor to take a stand and lead the opposition, but it does come at a trade-off.
I think you also in that have to ask yourself, is there anything that California could have done in this federal administration to change the outcomes of any of those things? Because I don't think there is, right? But I think often there is. I'm not sure if there is now. And I do want to say this issue of talking about this 10-year, 20-year horizon is real, but it's hard to do that with a lot of certainty in this political environment. I'm struggling with what I can. There was a time when you could say, this is how an election works. This is how the polling works. This is how we know what's going to happen when the electorate comes out to vote. And that's not the same. It's just not the same now. What's happening culturally in our country is changing that.
Just to the other side, though, just to defend running for president and Gavin Newsom for a minute, it's talk about the governor's power. Look, the housing reforms that we've gotten wouldn't have happened without the governor. And I think that was partly driven by I've got to have a solution to this if I'm running for president. So that might be the other side of the coin. If Governor Newsom wasn't running for president, would he have pushed the housing issue as much? I don't know. Because
he has been.
But I'm saying he has. If he wasn't running for president, would he not have pushed so hard because he knew he had to show progress to run for president? So I'm saying that's where running for president might not be as bad as we're saying it is. Maybe, if you're going to be on the national stage facing all that microscope, maybe that does urge you to be bolder on getting some stuff done in California. I'm just giving the other side of it.
Yeah, no, I think that's good. I think for me, the thing that is important here is that what the current governor has done is embolden a movement, in a way that I think is really, really important. So I actually wasn't trying to call out the governor, but this issue of someone needed to stand up very loudly in a way that could be heard by everyday people. And I think for a lot of us, it's that's really not the way we think about like, I look at the governor's Twitter and I'm like, would I want the governor tweeting like that? Is that what I think is like gubernatorial? And I think that's not a relevant question right now, because the question is like, what do people need to hear and see in order to feel like there's relevance? So yeah.
Thanks. So I'm going to touch the third reel and see what happens. High-speed rail debacle is now seen as a symbol of failed governance in California. What lessons, if any, can we draw from that experience? I think we'll start with that. If you want to jump in, you don't have to.
Yeah, so I'm not ready to call it dead yet, to be clear. But it's been 16 years, and I still had to take a Southwest flight up today. So it's not going well. I think part of this is California has a lot of elements of its government that allow us to do big things without getting a big consensus together. And direct democracy is one of those things, right? Every statewide initiative passes with 50% plus one of the vote, no matter how big it is, right? Yeah, so we did term limits on just barely over 50%. We created the California Redistricting Commission, a great thing, with just over 50% of the vote. We do big changes to our Constitution, and high-speed rail was passed barely over 50% of the vote without a big public movement, without a big public consensus, at the last possible minute when it could pass, just before the world went into a horrendous recession in 2008. So it passes with not much consensus at a time when the state then goes into like 8 straight years of budget deficits. It was underfunded. $10 billion was not nearly enough. So it didn't really start with either a public consensus or sufficient funding to do the job that it set out to do. But probably more important from that was it ran into this 3-level government problem that so often stifles progress, right? In order to do big things, the state government has to work with local governments and it has to work with the federal government. High-speed rail really required federal funding to happen, and when the Biden administration was pushing it and the Obama administration, that was great. During the 2 Trump administrations, federal government has canceled grants, and that has killed it. But probably more importantly, there's been local opposition from local governments who didn't see it delivering benefits to them, and in the first few years, essentially extracted a rent from people to do local rail improvements, to use this statewide money to do local rail improvements in Los Angeles and in the Bay Area. But it's really local opposition that kind of killed it. And then I think finally the third and final thing was there was never a well-articulated vision for what high-speed rail was supposed to do. It was not supposed to make my life easier getting from San Diego to Berkeley, right? It was not for people in LA and San Francisco. It was for people in the Central Valley of California. Central Valley of California, which, when we had that 6-state initiative that would have divided up into a Silicon state, the richest state in the country, a southern state that would have been also hugely rich, that area, the central state in Central California, would have been the poorest state in the union, poorer by per capita income than Alabama and Mississippi. The promise of high-speed rail was to open up the job opportunities in the coast to people who could live in areas where it's affordable to live in California. That vision was never properly articulated and never got the political consensus behind it that I think would have taken for it to succeed.
So Nancy wrote long answers to a lot of these questions, but this one she wrote, even after 14 years in the legislature, I'm still trying to figure that one out. So that's probably sums up trying to figure out high-speed rail. I would just say, and this is with my kids advocate hat on, and sort of like, yeah, sure, big things, but like, when do we do big things that will really benefit the entire state and our future? I would rather be the big thing saying, let's redo the master plan and make sure all levels of our higher ed system are really leading the country. I think one of the issues of our time is early childhood. A lot of Republicans would tell you that as well, because other countries, it's embarrassing, right? And plus what we know now about brain development. I mean, most countries spend 10, 15, 20, 25,000 per capita on early childhood. We spend 500. It's why we are dropping so far. So I would rather be the big thing, early childhood. So personally, I was like, great, nice to have, but early childhood education, other things are have to have. Let the big thing be that. So like, I was never a big high-speed rail. Rah, 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 would be great to have, but it wasn't top priority. And the last thing is, human nature has so much impact on politics, and a lot of folks in the room know that, and just like Jerry Brown didn't kick it off, but I think he was so focused on high-speed rail because he, after ripping his dad for decades, then as he got older, he was like, oh my gosh, maybe my dad was right doing these big things, so I got to do a big thing. It'll be high-speed rail, because it was surprising to me how much he pushed it, and in retrospect, maybe that was a mistake for all the difficult things we've talked about in terms of funding and actually getting this thing done.
I would just say that we have a vitocracy in California. It is so much easier to not build things than it is to build things. And part of this, if you're going to invest in and build high-speed rail, one, it would be nice if it was high speed, which it is not. And that's true on the East Coast too, in the Acela. But I do think it's important for the country to invest in things that are long thinking and that help shift the way the country thinks about where we live and how we live. So to me, it's a really important thing. I also think there's an argument to be made that when you're talking about the Central Valley, it's as much talking about bringing jobs to those people as it is about talking about bringing those people to jobs. And I'm sure Kate is nodding. I can't quite see her, but and the last thing I'll just say is if you're building something massive that is of state level concern, that everyone has because here's the thing, 50% plus one might not sound like a lot until you imagine this was an incredibly expensive endeavor that most people in the state would never use. And when you think about it that way, 50% plus one is actually kind of amazing. And then the last thing is we just need to be able to preempt local control over big projects at state level concern. That's for utilities, that's for all of that. Because every California sets really good goals, and then it makes it almost impossible, in my opinion, to implement them on the time frame and with the budget that it needs. And then everything just kind of rolls and becomes more expensive and slower and slower. So you got to fish or cut bait on this stuff, fundamentally.
So since Ted brought up early childhood education, leads into this question. California governance often suffers from what the political scientist Steve Tellis calls kludge, which means policies patched together in complex and incoherent ways. As one example, California has, I think, 14 separate funding streams for early childhood education. And we've had this for a while, and people have tried to reform it and failed. So why, in your view, is it so hard to design and implement simple and effective policies? And I think we'll start with Ted.
I'm not sure how much this is a California-specific problem, as opposed to some of the other issues we've talked about. I'm sure there's some states and localities that do it better, but it is a huge problem. And I think part of it, and I say this as a general, well, I don't know what terms mean anymore, but as a Democrat who wants government to do a lot, I think government is so complex. I'm an abundance Democrat. That government has gotten so complex that it feeds on itself rather than stepping back. So in the kid space, it's like, and especially now with AI and technology, why don't we just have one county person assigned, the minute you're going to give birth to that person, and they can help that mom or that family get through every government service that they need from early childhood all the way through. I mean, that would be sensible. That would be consumer friendly. Right now what we tell a parent who doesn't speak the language, working 3 jobs to make it, is having to figure out a maze of hundreds of programs to benefit their kids and their families. So it doesn't make sense. I don't think it's a California only problem, but back to the governor, if that would be an issue. And it's interesting, in our webinar, each of the candidates, who have been sort of very dug into government, all were very excited by that question. They said, oh, we need to reinvent government. We need to make it more consumer friendly. We need to consolidate agencies. So it's so necessary. I think you need a governor really to step in and say that's going to be a priority, because it's a heavy lift.
Melissa?
Yeah. This is the one where I had a ton of notes, and I'm like, I've already said a bunch of things, but I think this comes back to like, when you're talking about the programs in California that are designed to build things, right, to create things, not necessarily to provide a service, because I think those two things can look different in terms of how they play out. There's just no decision-making authority. Like, point at who gets to decide if that apartment building goes up or that train station stop goes in. It is 20,000 people. Like, it's not 20,000 people, but it's a lot of people. And so that's like this incredible problem that there's no one who can say yes to a project, but dozens of people who can say no. And those are not all powerful people. We have systems in this state where any human being that has a law degree or can find a pro bono lawyer can try to stop almost anything that we're trying to do, and can certainly slow it down to the point where even if they lose, they have created an environment where it's no longer economically feasible to do the project. So I think that's one piece. I think we don't fund implementation of things, and I want to talk about this. We demand so much planning from local government, and there is no money for them to implement. I've been doing this a while. We might be able to talk to Chris later, and he might be able to explain this, but I don't understand why we are planning the SCS strategy over here and the RENA strategy over here, when a bunch of the work that the local government needs to do to figure out where we want to put stuff is the same. And we're doing it like 4 years apart, and we're going affordability here, environmental sustainability there. Like, that's inefficient. We give money to do the planning, it's not enough, and then there's no money to do the implementation. So I think that creates a lot of kludge. And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that, yes, it is. This governor has tried to start pulling together different agencies and to streamline that. But at the end of the day, it's not just about streamlining agencies, it's about getting the right leadership into those agencies and having people stay. The turnover is kind of unbelievable in terms of what we are trying to get done. So I would raise that, and then I'd say, and I'd be more interested in the work that I do in streamlining the funding vehicles, in saying every ounce of money that you're going to use to do this kind of work is on the same timeline, has the same definition of readiness, has the same criteria, the same mandates. And I think that could be a slightly easier lift than putting all the agencies together, and it would make a big difference.
I agree with what you've said about government getting in its own way, and I love your diagnosis and the term vetocracy. So this question was framed about policies. I think of us as having, at the governance level, a kludge constitution, right? We don't have a single cohesive document put together by a set of framers with one political theory in mind, in the way that the United States government has. What we have is a really long book. So when I teach California politics, I have this like giant book that is the California Constitution, and the little bookmark in it is the U.S. Constitution. Our Constitution was written first and then rewritten through this horrendous 1878, 1879 Constitution that was super anti-immigrant. And since then, we have changed it an average of 5 times per year. Right? And we are addicted to piecemeal reform in California. And so what that's led is a government that has these different theoretical impulses guiding it, right? You have this progressive impulse, even at the time when the most significant revisions were being made around the progressive area, you have this progressive impulse that wants a muscular government to do a lot of things, and then this populist impulse that wants to fragment power, create a hybrid democracy with representatives in Sacramento looking over their shoulder at the public, with the public doing ballot box budgeting and controlling what Sacramento can spend, and with an executive branch that's fragmented into different constitutional offices. All of this creates, makes it difficult for California government to work, but it's the way that we've done things. And until there is something more cataclysmic in California, I don't see us moving away from piecemeal reform. And so I think what we've got to do is just sort of piecemeal with a little bit more of a guiding and cohesive strategy, rather than just whatever this year's electorate wants.
And real quick, I would want Nancy to jump in here because she made a really important point. It's not just a constitution, it's how our legislature functions. I had a bill that changed 2 words, and that was its own bill. And I got a lot of great media in my district, but that should not have been a bill. So Nancy is suggested bill limits and really strictly, where if we could consolidate these bills to sort of force folks to look more broadly rather than, all these little bills coming at the governor. So I think that exacerbates the problem, and we should change that.
Okay, this has been great. I think it's time now to bring in the audience. So the way we're going to do this is put your hand up if you have a question. I'm going to take a few questions at a time, and then the panelists can kind of decide what they want to respond to. And Amanda's going to pass a mic around. Even if you have a loud voice, please use the mic so that it will be captured by the recorder. So I see here, and then, okay. That's Eric in the blue shirt there.
Hey, thanks. This has been a great conversation. So the question that I had was, you've touched on it a little bit here and there, but it seems like housing seems like such a big issue. And that's really kind of a local governance problem more than anything. And I feel like some of the reforms that have passed have been almost like concentrated governance reforms where the state is stepping in and taking a more active control of the process. And I'm just wondering if you see any other areas that are like that. Do you see any other areas where local government could be reformed? I mean, like LA has the LA County Board of Supervisors is 5 people over this enormous population, that kind of thing.
I think I saw Kate, your hand up. Yeah, we're going to take 3 questions.
This is a great conversation. Thank you, guys. You referred to a couple of times, and that you said this, there's a lot of inequality in between the regions of the state. And the state, in some ways, a lot of things are designed so that continues to be true. So we have a lot of proportional representation obviously in the legislature. A lot of things are done per capita in terms of spending. All of them big money is in the Bay Area and LA. So there's a huge incentive for donors to the Democratic Party. Everybody's a Democrat. The governor's the head of that party. And the progressive tax system actually sort of perversely leads to a lot of bending over backwards for the super wealthy people in the state. I'm just wondering, all of that sort of leads in a direction of kind of not paying very much attention to the Central Valley and the rural parts of the state. And I'm wondering if there's a governance answer to that. Some states seem to do this better than we do, and are at least paying a little more attention to the parts of the state that are not their big population centers. And I'm wondering, is there something we could do to think about that from a governance perspective, or is that sort of just a campaign finance reform democracy question?
Let's respond to those questions. Actually. So who would like to, feel free to jump in.
All right, I'll hop in. Thanks for the questions. It's good to see audience members more qualified than the panelists. On Eric's question, so you asked about local. You're right. Overriding local government is one of the directions that we're going. But I think also reforming local governments and addressing the democratic deficit. Because if you think your students don't know who their state legislators are, they really don't know who their local legislators are, and they may not have been involved in picking them. But I think actually 2 of the most powerful reforms we've had in California in a generation have come at the local level. So one is the California Voting Rights Act, which has actually led to more jurisdictional changes than the U.S. Voting Rights Act by essentially moving to district representation at city councils and school boards and hospital boards in a way that's massively increased Latino representation in particular and Asian American representation, and is changing a lot of policies. The second is a set of reforms that came out of a PPIC study at its root by my colleague Zoli Heinal that showed that when you had out-of-cycle local elections rather than ones at the same time as a governor's or presidential race, you had much smaller electorates, much less representative electorates. And the state law that changed that and moved those on cycles brought about 1 million more people into voting in local governments. And increased both the racial and ethnic diversity, but also had many more renters voting in local elections than before, something that I think will help in the long term in this fight for housing. And I think California has also been experimenting and should experiment with things like ranked choice voting and proportional representation at the local level, where they can mess up fewer things, and study those before we do a statewide ballot initiative to enact any of those ideas for the state.
Yeah, I'm really the other question intrigued by the rural areas. I mean, I guess if you look historically, before one person, one vote, the rural areas controlled the whole freaking state. But so we don't want to do that. But I guess part of it is what we talked about earlier. It's not that only Republicans represent those areas, but actually, I found when I was in the legislature, it was more bipartisan. The rural areas had more. I guess the last thing I would say, totally agree, and the inequality in California, which I should have mentioned at the beginning on the list of our problems, we lead the country in inequality. And it's not just in the rural areas, to your point, the poorest congressional district in the country is in California, but there's an enormous number of people incredibly poor in the area I live in Silicon Valley. And just like we too often say, we deal a lot with folks nationally. Oh, you're so lucky you're in California. Sort of. And just like, oh, you're so lucky in the Bay Area, you're so lucky in LA. The inequality is throughout the state. So yes, we need to focus in on the rural areas, but that inequality that we deal with is just so pronounced, everywhere, throughout California, and obviously we need to tackle that.
We have a lot of cities, right? And so I think you just have to acknowledge that like land use, especially when we're thinking about housing, in a perfect world, it would be determined at the local level. Like that's how it would work. The reason it's being preempted is because it didn't work that way for 50 years, right? So we're trying to fast track and kind of deal with that significant problem. At the same time, we've got there's so little money for local government. Local government officials, except from the biggest cities, don't make real money, right? So that's really a challenge. When we say, oh, you're in a 40,000 person city and you're trying to resolve something around housing, and you're supposed to go to war with your neighbors over it, get screamed at the Trader Joe's because that is their life, while you're getting a $500 a month stipend, that's a lot to ask of people. So there are governance challenges, I think, which is we don't pay for governance at the local level, but we expect them to be able to do things. And then I think also like we should start really thinking about, I'm going to say something, and this is not a serious policy proposal, but there's a deep part of me that thinks it would be easier to just take all the money that we're spending to try and fix housing or infrastructure in California and go, instead of creating all these programs, we'll just pay local government for every single unit at a specific level of like median income. Like we'll just pay for success, right? Because we have all of these programs and they're all fragmented. And so we think about, and when government and the legislature sits down to fix that, they are talking to local government and they are talking to state legislators and staff. That's who they're talking to. And we think about how do we make it work for them? But government doesn't build a lot of housing, right? Developers build housing. Developers build power plants. They do transmission lines. And I feel like there's not a recognition that we need to be thinking about what are the decisions we make that make it easier for people to build the things we need so we can lower the costs that are really crippling California and driving people out of the state.
Take a few more questions. I see in the red back there, and then in the red up here.
It's maroon. It's maroon.
My question may not be, it may be broader than California-specific governance, but it's definitely one we face here. And it's maybe along the abundance lines, but on talking about kind of the kludge and the sort of disparate population of potential vetoers for all sorts of projects. I think of some of that as developing kind of as a pendulum swinging the other way to Robert Moses, bulldozing neighborhoods for freeways. And, in some of this, like if things happen far enough apart and you don't have cultural memory in the electorate, you're kind of stuck with the pendulum swing. But is there a way to marry kind of the best realizations of learning from our current kludge and inability to build with just can't kick too many poor people out for freeways, or if you do, you got to pay them better. Can we find a place in between those, or is there really no good way to marry those and it's just straight trade-offs?
Thanks. Up here.
Okay, so first a comment and then a question, okay? I was a little shocked that when we were giving grades out for California, nobody mentioned our leadership on climate issues, okay? And that is world class, what we're doing. So it's a good thing you didn't put me on the panel with that because we would have said the same thing, okay? All right, so here's the question. It's a
Done my job.
curveball. It's a curveball. So when we run our local government institute trainings in the summer, the last couple years, what's been on the mind of a lot of local government people is the way to incorporate AI into providing services and taking public comment, et cetera. And I know from just the kids that are working on it at Cal and Stanford, that there's a lot of the large language models have gotten a lot better. And it's quite possible that these tools now are such that they really can help. What do you know about that? Anybody have any ideas about that? Any fears, things going on in the legislature that we don't know about with respect to this? Because it is a wave that's coming, from what I can tell. The implementation of AI, yes, going on in San Francisco right now. It's being discussed. And there's resistance within the city, but there are a lot of people that will be playing with these tools.
Let's go to the panel.
I'll do it. Oh, sorry, do you have it?
No, go ahead.
I mean, I think we need to be piloting things in AI, but like that's how we need to be approaching this. Because the reality is I think there's huge potential. You look at things like permitting, right? So when we want to permit something, we're going through, you got to go to them and then you go to them and then they approve it and then it comes back and it's sequential. And I think that you look at AI and AI would have the ability to look at all the historic feedback from those same parties and try and like get to an earlier model that they could all potentially respond to more quickly. So I think there's that. I also think there's already lawmakers using AI. I've been in 2 separate occasions where I've been talking to a bot when I contacted a legislative office. And okay, if I get good information from the bot, great. But how do I know I'm getting great information from the bot? And how do I know I'm even talking to a bot unless I have tested for that? And I want to be clear, if you're calling your legislator, you have every right to know if you're getting AI help or if you're getting human help, right? So that you know how to judge that. And then you were talking about abundance. And on that, I just want to say, we think of abundance as a policy platform, and it is not. You look at Niskanen, thank you, it's embarrassing. They did a really great report where they looked at all these different kinds of abundance. And they termed them abundance, green abundance, black abundance. And they talked about how everybody's trying to fit into this larger narrative. So what we have right here is we have a narrative that's about abundance, which is really powerful. But we have to make sure that the good policy framework within that abundance framework is the one that gets elevated. That's all.
On abundance, you ended with, is it just trade-offs? Yes, absolutely. It is just trade. I think that's sort of what, that doesn't mean that we don't need to be in a different part of the continuum between red tape and more building. I think the pendulum does need to shift, and it is starting to shift, and that is going to be a good thing. But those every piece of red tape is individually there for a good reason, in which there was a strong consensus to do that at that point. And so there will be some trade-offs to what gets built is going to be built on something, and someone will be a local loser in that. But it still may be absolutely worthwhile for sustainable green energy projects, for climate change adaptation projects, for housing projects, and for other a delta alternative conveyance and other things we need to do. And then on that question first, yes, you're right. Climate change should have been. I felt it was so like California does this with it's incontrovertible that California has become the nation's leader in climate change, and you're right to point out that an evaluation of government that doesn't show that has been a big success is lacking. And on the use of AI in local government, there are a lot of ways in which AI can be used to do more efficiently what government always wants to do and is doing a bit of, which is communicate with you and make you feel like it cared, right? And so I think that's what people are going to have an incentive. But what I really worry about is using AI to try to kind of replace democracy. I've heard some of this narrative coming out. I've heard narrative coming out in some parts of Sacramento about, well, we need to move to democracy 2.0 or 3.0 because these old elections aren't working anymore, and so we need to have deliberative polls done through a conversation with an AI chatbot that everyone can have in their room, and we're going to use that as a way to make an end run around representative democracy. And I'm not sure that is a technological problem. Yes, you can summarize what the public wants in a lot of ways, but if you lose the humanity in that, which is what legislators respond to, I don't think that summary is going to sort of advance collective action that represents what people want.
I don't want a failing grade from the legendary Bruce Kane, so thank you for saying that, highlighting climate change. And when we talk about California rocks and doing well, and we certainly should highlight the environment, LGBTQ plus rights, not long ways to go, but a national leader. And I'll actually use that to answer your part about AI, and that is pick the issue. And it's hard to find an example where California didn't lead the way and across the ideological spectrum. I mean, exclusionary zoning was invented here in Berkeley. Read our racist history. Oh, my God. A lot of what I would view bad stuff, the anti-tax movement, so much started here. Lots of what I would call personally good things, environmental movements. What happens in California is so critical nationally and even internationally. So Congress better not preempt state rights on AI, and I'm very encouraged by what's happening in Sacramento, where some of the best legislators are really tackling the issues of AI, both the pros and the cons, and are being very responsible about it. I know Children Now worked on a bill with Buffy Wicks where we worked very closely with industry, where pushed them hard, but came up with a really good thing on online safety. So I think California should be the leader on how government responds to AI. And then, like so many other issues, hopefully that goes nationally and could be an international model as well. So I'm happy that some of the best legislators are really digging in on that issue right now.
Take a few more questions. I see over there. And black shirt, brown sweater.
So I have two questions for Thad, but welcome comments from the other panelists. One question is sparked by your opening comments on various indicators such as educational attainment and crime that California has been improving in the ranks of the states on. It's been improving in the ranks of the states at the same time as there's been this geographic resorting of population driven by our housing policies, where we're losing poor people and we're gaining affluent people from other states. And so to what extent are those trends a function of California policy versus, or the good parts of California policy versus the demographic changes that are a function of the bad parts of California policy? Second question, some years ago you wrote a book about term limits and how term limits had the effect of shifting power towards governors relative to the legislature. And as I recall, I haven't read that book in a while, but that was a conclusion that was a little dispiriting to you and that you were hoping to see a revitalization of legislative power. And I wonder, given your newfound pessimism about the prospects for partisan competition as a way of balancing broad public interest versus special interest or concentrated interest group interest within parties, do you now think that we should actually be strengthening the governor vis-a-vis the legislature as a non-party check on interest group power within the Democratic legislative coalition?
Let's take a few more questions. I see, let's go here.
Hey, my name is Maxwell, a senior here at Berkeley, and also, speaking of abundance, president of Students for Abundance at Berkeley. And one question for you, Melissa, but also the other panelists, is around the culture in our government agencies. We've been reading Recoding America by Jen Pahlka, and she critiques public agencies. She talks about the perverse incentive structures and the culture of risk aversion in these agencies as one very important bottleneck to policy implementation. I'm curious your thoughts on how we can start to change that culture.
Let's take one more question. Over here.
Thanks. I'd like to go back to a point someone made earlier on, and that's about the transparency and accountability. Something we heard at a conference in January here was that that's much lacking, and the notion of an adequately informed electorate is sorely lacking with the shriveling of media coverage of local and state issues. We're just not hearing the feedback back. You know, here's your local representative, here's what they did, it was really great, and vice versa. But that kind of information flow, it's not just your linguistically isolated and underpaid head of household that doesn't have time for this to sort through information and distinguish between the mis, dis, and malinformation that the big money in the voting process, the electoral process, makes a hell for us all. So a bit more on the mechanics that might be implemented there at the grassroots so that statistics that Thad trots out about satisfaction might actually mean something.
Thanks. Well, let's start with that since you were invoked.
All right, Chris, great questions, and I hope to dive in deeper with you on them, and I'll try to just be quick. One, I think that's a really perceptive theory. Are crime trends really a function of demographic trends? So broadly, nationally, they are, right? Crime trends are hugely driven by how many 18 to 24-year-old men there are and what the employment prospects are. That has been part of these cohort changes and part of what's going on nationally. California used to be a kind of importer of high-income people, exporter of low-income people. That has been less so in the last 6 or 7 years, but it's not sort of large enough to really drive this overall trend. So I'm not a criminologist. My sense is that California still has, really unfortunately, a large enough poverty rate that it is not just a sort of a lack of people with poor prospects. On that question of term limits, kneecap the legislature and give power to the governor, shouldn't we all be in favor of them? So I'm not as optimistic about governors as the solution to all problems in California. I mean, Gavin Newsom pushed for CEQA reform and SB 79, but he could have done that for years and years. He just wasn't, he chose not to. I think governors are not always impervious to interest group power. And I have this Madisonian belief that in co-equal branches of government and checks and balances between them that I would like to see more of in DC rather than less of in Sacramento.
We have questions on media, questions on culture and agencies.
Just on the media, one, at state and local government is where there's a huge problem. I mean, national media, we have a little bit more. So I think Cal Matters, Politico, EdSource, I mean, thank goodness. But, just to get very direct, I would not have won for the legislature if it wasn't for the local media covering my race, because the voters, 1.8 papers delivered to your doorstep at that time. And our rate, we had 2 political reporters covering my race. I won an upset race. This is not about me, it's about media. And so you were a voter in that district. There was articles about my assembly race 3 days a week, pictures. You couldn't afford not to have seen it and been connected. Today, I'm embarrassed. Oh wait, what's going on in my area? And I'm a political junkie. I mean, and so it's a huge problem. And that especially at the state and local government level. I mean, I've had bills that would not have passed without an LA Times reporter covering the bill all the way through, showing what the oil industry was saying, and putting so much pressure on folks. The sunlight made the bill go through. So I think you're highlighting a really key area. I think Cal Matters does an exceptional job, but I don't know how many people. Cal Matters is not tossed on your front driveway, right? So I think that's an issue that bears a lot more focus. I have way more sports information than I've ever needed, but I'm not sure I can name. I'm not going to embarrass myself. I'm not sure I can name all the local officials in my area.
I feel like the conversation, though, when we're talking about media, is about the informed electorate, right? It's about what's their role in informing the electorate. And I think we have to acknowledge that what is the appropriate level? What do we expect of an everyday person? Do we expect them to understand 5,000 bills moving through 1 year of the legislature? Do we expect them to understand 17 ballot measures on their ballot? Or like there's a reality that like when we're thinking about citizen or resident input on a new affordable housing project, we ask at every stage, here, let's talk to you 4 times when we're doing RENA and we're planning for that. Let's talk to you when we're considering what we might do with this site. Let's talk about the actual design of the site now that we've hired an architect. Let's talk about what you who live in this city think about the setback and the height and all these technical things. And I think it's reflective of a lack of trust in the role of government. And that's the invisible thing that is really driving a lot of this, where instead of being like, it's my job as a citizen to elect people and then hold them accountable for what they said they would do, it becomes, it's my job to do government's job. I cannot tell you how frustrated I get when I read some ballot measures and I'm like, the legislature could have done this. And they're not doing it because it's politically hard to do. And so they're sticking it on the backs of an electorate that should not be expected to do that. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And also that there are inherent challenges around like an informed electorate. You grow more informed at certain points in your life. The reality is historically, although it's changing, you are much more likely to engage in local politics once you bought a house or had a kid. And that's still true, although it's growing less true, which I think is amazing and wonderful. But like, that's not a decision people make. They don't sit down and go, I don't care about local politics. They're just not actively being pulled into it. I mean, if there's one thing I think it's a shame people don't do if they care about these things, is like just stalk their city council meetings. I guess this all the time. Like, my city council pays people $500 a month, and they go in their meetings till 3 o'clock, and their total experience is being yelled at no matter what they try to do. And so while I give them I criticize them, I also like, I don't do their job. I haven't done it. I didn't run for local office. I know what that entails. So I wanted to say that. And then on the abundance piece, and Recoding America, I think, yes, it is true that local government and state government is risk averse. And I love that book. I also think, though, we have to be careful how we extrapolate. Government is not, like, government's supposed to be stable. It's not supposed to be disruptive. Like, so no matter what you hear, the idea that we want people just like ripping stuff apart in government and hoping that we're testing and it'll all work out, that hurts human beings in a really significant way. So I think figuring out how do we create more tolerance for risk in the areas where the stakes are so high. And I really think when you look at climate change, when you look at housing, when you look at public health right now, and education, that's worthwhile. And the other thing I will say about the abundance movement is so much of it is so much of this in terms of what we can do faster and better requires technology, right? Whether it's AI or just other forms of technology. And government cannot compete for that talent, and that is a huge problem. Government cannot hire the people who understand how this works. And while other people might say, I'm fine with taking the advice from the companies that can pay those people, I am not one of them. Like, I think government needs its own talent who understands these issues.
Well, I think that's a good place to close, and we're at time, so let's all give a round of applause to our panelists.